relief program, phase 2 that USDA put through. This is a short time frame presentation, but we want to get the information out there. We have some speakers from USDA. I want to welcome them. I will let them introduce themselves when we get started here, but just they're going to be able to give you an overview of what the program is, how this revenue-based program works, kind of provide the step-by-step process, understanding the differences between the needed documentation for the application process, and then have some Q&A if there's questions at the end. But I will give it over to our USDA team to introduce themselves and to continue on.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Vasquez. I am the section head of the disaster assistance section, and we are charged with the development and not so much the implementation of the policy, but the development of the policy, and then getting everyone trained up in the field. And then on here we have our staff of our program specialists. We have Michael Williams, Melissa Stutrud, Aaron Blackburn, and so I'll let them, and Melanie, so I'll let them come on real quick and say hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Williams. As Chris said, I'm part of the ERP team and glad to be here today.
I'm Melissa Stutrud, part of the ERP detail, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Hello, I'm Aaron Blackburn. I am part of the ERP task force team too as well, and it's good to be with you all to share some of our program stuff.
I'm Melanie Sullivan. I'm trying to turn my camera on, but since I'm sharing my screen, I don't think it's working, but it's nice to be here with you guys.
Hi, I'm Sneak Griffin. I'm with the ERP team, and I'm losing my voice a little bit, but it's nice to be here with you guys.
Like us to just go ahead
I think we can go right into our first presentation.
Okay.
Is it Melissa?
Yes, Melissa will be the first speaker. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Sounds good.
So just to give you a little bit of information about ERP, Janet had shared with us that most of you have had an opportunity to go through some training materials that we'd had out earlier. And this was an opportunity to take that information and kind of glean it down to what specifically you wanted to cover. So that's how we've tailored this presentation. So if we haven't addressed all the things that you wanted to talk about, please let us know, and we'll certainly try to do that. We'll keep this very informal. Next slide, Mel. Thank you. For those of you that are unfamiliar with dealing with FSA or working with FSA programs, we included a slide on how to find a county office so you can have face-to-face contact to help you, learn about our programs that we have available, and also provide some face-to-face assistance on how to fill those forms and participate in those programs. We also have special accommodation information available if you need any of those services. What to expect when you first come into an office. Most of the programs that we have are tied to land. So eventually you'll be associated with a farm number. But usually when you come in to participate in a program, we'll cover what programs we offer. We have fact sheets, other information that you can review. And then we need to get you into the system. So we'll ask some contact information, name, address, social security numbers, information about what type of farming operation you have. If you farm as an individual, if you farm as a joint operation or an entity such as a corporation, that type of information we would need. If you do participate in a program that ends up tying to land, usually we need some type of document that shows that you're in general control of property, and that's how we assign a farming number. And then also, if you farm as something other than an individual, or if you're using signature capacity such as a power of attorney or anything like that, we need those documents too to show who's authorized to sign on your behalf. Or like I said, if you farm as an entity, we need to know who can sign for the entity and bind that entity. So the form that we record that customer core database on is called an AD 2047. Gives phone numbers, email, name and address, social security numbers, that kind of thing. Also in the county office, we have fact sheets available that show you what programs we administer, and also what forms would be applicable for each of those programs. We also have something called Gov Delivery, which is an excellent notification process. It comes in the form of emails or text messages. It's a free service, and it gives information on new programs that come up. You know, we're coming up on an expiring farm bill, so there's going to be a lot of announcements with new programs, sign up periods. It's a good way to find out about deadlines, or if certain things are available, like, you know, maps to pick up if you need maps, imagery. But that's a good service to sign up for and stay current on programs and any developments that come up. And then we'll also talk about forms that are applicable to each program. So specifically for ERP Phase 2, since that's the topic for today, this slide shows a listing of all the forms that would be required to participate, and then also 2 additional forms that would be optional. So we'll start off with the FSA 521. That's the application itself, and that's paired with a linkage form, and the linkage form is the FSA 522. So ERP is something we consider a contingent payment. You know, it's a program that you sign up for, you complete an application, the agency would pay a benefit, and then for 2 years after the year of accepting that payment, you would be required to take crop insurance or NAP coverage at a specified level as a condition of accepting that payment. And we'll talk more about the application process in detail, and also the linkage requirement. Janet had shared with us, those are 2 areas that you wanted to cover more in detail, so we'll make sure to do that. That 2047, that's the form where we obtain your contact information to get you into the system. The 902 and the 901, that's probably one of the most important forms that we file with our agency. We use that form, and also NRCS uses that form. It records information about your farming operation, what type of operation it is, if you farm as an individual, a corporation, a general partnership. We need to communicate with IRS. So anytime we're paying something other than a social security number, IRS requires us to inform them if we're paying tax ID number XYZ, who's the warm body that's actually a recipient indirectly through that payment. So that's another function of the 902. The 902, the farm operating plan, it's a form that's filled out basically through an interview process, and it's a narrative of how you run the day-to-day farming operation, who's involved. It concentrates on areas of elements, land, capital, equipment, labor, and management is primarily what we look at. And then who in your farming operation is actually doing those things or providing those contributions. Are the contributions at risk? So a lot of eligibility determinations come from that farm operating plan. And that's something you'll work with the county office on how to fill out. And it differs depending on what type of operation you have, because it establishes a payment limitation based on what type of operation you have and what programs that you want to participate in. So a lot of information is gleaned from that document. And then the AD 1026, that's a form that some of you are probably familiar with. It's been around for a long time. If you farm land that's considered highly erodible, or if you have wetlands on your property, In order to participate in USDA programs, and this would go for FSA, NRCS, and now recently this is also tied to crop insurance, you'll work with NRCS to develop a conservation plan to follow to make sure you stay in compliance if you have highly erodible land in your farming operation. And then also wetlands, if there's no prior violation, if a wetland dries up naturally, it can be farmed. However, if you're going to participate in USDA programs, there's stipulations against filling, leveling, that kind of thing as far as wetlands. So the 902 and the 1026 aren't forms that are filled out every year. They're only filled out if there's changes to your operation, changes in shares, members. The 1026 would be like if you added additional land and maybe you wanted to clean out existing drains, not go any further. So those forms aren't filed every year, but they're filed when you make changes. So those are the required forms to participate in ERP Phase 2. And then there's 2 additional optional forms. So the CCC 860, that is a self-certification form. If you identify as socially disadvantaged, limited resource, or beginning farmer or veteran farmer status, that's a form that you would fill out, and it can result in additional benefits depending on the program. So socially disadvantaged would deal with gender, race. A limited resource would deal with income. So there's an annual qualifier, and we'll have information on that too, so you can review that. And then beginning farmer, that's basically if you've farmed more than 10 years, you would no longer qualify as a beginning producer. And then veteran status also deals with that 10-year requirement, and then also when you became a veteran. The FSA 510 form is the other optional form. Each program, when it's announced, has a standard payment limitation that's attached to it. And the FSA 510 is unique where it looks at sources of income. So if more than, or if at least 75% of your income comes from farming, ranching, and forestry, you could complete that optional FSA 510 form, and it could actually increase your payment limitation. And we'll talk about how that's impacted when we get a little bit further into ERP. All of those forms that we just covered, actually any form that FSA deals with, is available on this website. So there's an image of the form, and there's also detailed instructions on how to fill those forms out. So we mentioned earlier that normally when we pay, or if you do business with FSA, a lot of our programs are tied to land. And what comes with that is showing that you're in general control of land, so we can make an association. This is another topic that you'd shared with Janet, that you wanted more information. Usually we have producers bring in a lease or a deed, or something like that would show general control. But if you have heirs property in your farming operation, you may not have access to either of those. But we have documents that can be used if you don't have access to a lease or a deed. So if you're in a state that's adopted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, these are 2 additional documents that you could bring in lieu of a lease or a deed. A court order verifying the land meets, the definition of heirs property, or a certification from the local recorder of deeds that the recorder owner of land is deceased and at least one heir has initiated the process of retitling the land. If you're not in one of those states, these are some additional documents that you could bring in. Tenancy in common agreement, tax returns for the previous 5 years, a self-certification document showing general control, or any other documentation that you feel might demonstrate that to the CED or the county committee. So the payment limitation on that optional form, that FSA 510, ERP has a standard payment limitation of $125,000 if you grow specialty crops, which we kind of use fruits and vegetables, or high value, which would be like organic would be an example of high value. And then other crops. So the standard payment limitation for all crop categories is $125,000 for those two categories. If you file the FSA 510 and at least 75% of your average adjusted gross income is from farming, ranching, and forestry. If you go to that next slide, Mel. Thank you. You actually can increase the payment limitation that's available under ERP up to 900,000 for growing specialty crops high value, and then changing 125,000 to 250,000 for a payment limitation for all other crops. A little bit more on that 902, we mentioned we take information to determine what type of farming operation you have. An individual can't exceed the annual amounts that are specified for the program. If you're a joint operation, such as a general partnership, we look at the members that are involved, and that kind of determines what the payment limitation would be for the joint operation. And then the legal entity, same thing there. We look at, there's different rules that apply whether you participate as a person, a joint operation, or a legal entity. And then we talked a little bit about this, but anytime we pay something other than a social security number, we have an obligation to show IRS, who's directly recipient of those payments, who's the warm body that's associated with those tax ID numbers. So when you fill out that 902 form for a legal entity, we track through 4 levels of ownership. So each person holding an interest, we would have to spell out who the members are. If we have embedded entities, like if you have a corporation and a member holding, say, a 25% interest as another corporation, okay, that's a second level. So IRS needs to know who's in that embedded corporation. So through 4 levels, that's how we deal with direct attribution and how we control payment limitation for people that farm with multiple interests. So for example, you have an interest as an individual, plus you're also a 25% shareholder of a corporation, and both of those farm. The corporation farms and you farm as an individual. You're still subject to a final payment limitation, and this direct attribution process is basically how we track that based on all your different farming operations that you participate in. And then, so that's how we deal with individual membership. However, if the Indian tribe or tribal organization is participating, like most FSA programs, the tribe or the organization itself would not be subject to payment limitation. Any questions? I know I kind of went through that pretty quickly, but any questions on any of the forms or any of that subject matter?
It doesn't look like any questions have come through yet, but we are
Okay.
keeping track of any questions that come through, and we can save them for the end as well.
Perfect, thank you. So with that, we'll go right into an overview on the ERP program, ERP Phase 2. So when we say Phase 2, ERP was implemented in 2 phases. The first phase was for those that carried crop insurance or NAP, and it actually earned an indemnity. So it's kind of like an additional payment for those that were paid for losses through their company or through NAP. And Phase 2 is intended to address losses that were not covered by Phase 1. So in order to be eligible for Phase 2, a producer must have suffered a crop loss due in whole or in part to a qualifying disaster event that occurred in calendar years 2020 or 2021. And that loss had to result in a decrease in allowable gross revenue in the disaster year in comparison to the benchmark year. As far as qualifying losses, if one crop suffered a qualifying loss, then revenue from all eligible crops is included in that calculation of allowable gross revenue. And what do we mean by eligible crops? Those crops produced in the United States as part of a farming operation. They're intended to be commercially marketed. But one caveat with commercially marketed, if you've got a crop that was never intended to be sold, but you had actual revenues such as an indemnity from crop insurance company or a NAP payment, even though you never intended to sell that eligible crop, we would still include that revenue that you received in the calculation of allowable gross revenue. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the next section. Eligible crops include crops that are insurable through crop insurance, covered through NAP, or crops that are not insurable or eligible for NAP. Crops that were ineligible for ERP Phase 2 are those that were intended for grazing, aquatic species that do not meet the definition of aquaculture, cannabis, and timber. So the disaster event itself needed to occur in calendar years 2020 or 2021. And the benchmark years that we're using for ERP Phase 2, you have a choice between 2018 and 2019, and that serves as a typical year of revenue, or kind of like your threshold. And then the disaster years covered by Phase 2 are 2020 and 2021. This was another area where you wanted some additional information. We get this question quite often. If a county needs to have a secretarial or presidential disaster declaration to be eligible. And for ERP, that is not a requirement, but you do need to have damage from a qualifying disaster event. And that had to occur in calendar year 2020 or 2021. So this slide indicates what those disaster events are. And then we also have something called related conditions, and that's on the next slide. So if you suffered an event like a derecho, it would also include damage impacted from or received from excessive wind. You can see how those are paired. The qualifying event had to occur, and then if you had damage from a related condition, that can be tied in to the program as well. Okay, the sign-up period currently runs through June 2nd. And there may be an announcement in the near future that impacts that deadline. But for right now, the sign up for Phase 2 started January 23rd and ends June 2nd. It's a producer certification-based program. So you're certifying to accurately record all of your information on the application itself. And that form number is that FSA 521. So you're certifying to a decrease in allowable gross revenue due to necessary expenses related to losses of eligible crops, due in whole or in part to that qualifying disaster event that occurred in calendar year 2020 or 2021. And then you're also certifying, if you participate in this program, that allowable gross revenue in the disaster year, and then also making that calculation for the benchmark year. To participate, you'd submit that FSA 521, and you're going to certify that all the information on there is accurate. And every program that we administer, almost everything we do is subject to spot check or some type of review process. So the requirement of this program is, in case you are pulled for spot check, you need to maintain all your supportive documentations that back up those certifications for a 3-year period. And then, like we said, it is a contingent program. So accepting the payment, you're agreeing to purchase crop insurance or NAP at a specified level for 2 years after the year of accepting that payment for all the crops that suffered a revenue loss. Okay, so these are those same forms, the eligibility forms that we talked about earlier. And there's currently a deadline to file these within 60 days of when a program deadline is announced. So the deadline will be coming up for these, since they've announced a deadline for sign up. And as far as available resources, again, the forms are all available online with instructions. And then this is another website where you'd be able to get those forms And then also any of the tools that have been developed to help with calculating allowable gross revenue and participating in this program. And we'll cover more on this later in the presentation as well. And that concludes my section.
All right, thanks, Melissa. I guess before we go on into a little bit more detail with our allowable gross revenue items, are there any questions at this point since Melissa just went through that overview of ERP Phase 2? Hearing none, I think we'll just go ahead and head on through. So as illustrated on this slide, allowable gross revenue is needed for both benchmark year and disaster year revenue. And I'm going to go through benchmark year revenue and disaster year revenue as we go through this section of the presentation. Allowable gross revenue is a self-certification, as Melissa had said, made by the producer or an authorized representative. Gross revenue is money earned through sales, services, and other means before expenses. So what is allowable gross revenue? Well, these three bullets kind of sum it up. For ERP Phase 2, allowable gross revenue refers to annual gross farm income before expenses derived from sales of eligible crops and certain government program payments directly related to eligible crops. And then allowable gross revenue also includes revenue from all eligible crops if one eligible crop experiences a qualifying disaster event. So if you have one loss on one crop, that basically will qualify all other crops, even if those crops didn't have a qualifying loss themselves. And then allowable gross revenue for a specific benchmark or disaster year is based on the year for which the revenue would have been reported for the purposes of filing a tax form. For the purposes of ERP Phase 2, allowable gross revenue includes income a producer received during the applicable tax year. Sales of eligible crops produced by a producer, which includes sales resulting from value added through post-production activities that could have been reported on IRS Schedule F. And our examples for that would be like corn sold for grain or jam made for processing from processing strawberries. So what if an applicant does not file federal taxes? Well, you don't have to have you wouldn't have had to have filed federal taxes to participate in the ERP Phase 2. That's not required to determine allowable gross revenue. If an applicant did not file IRS Schedule F, the applicant could use similar federal tax forms or supporting financial documentation to help them determine what their allowable gross revenue in the same manner as if they had filed a Schedule F. So short answer, you do not have to file Schedule F or federal tax forms. But what is important is you do have to have the evidence, if requested, where you got the amounts or where you determined your revenue amounts from. Allowable gross revenue includes sales of eligible crops that a producer purchased for resale and had a change in characteristic due to the time held. An example of that would be like a plant purchase in a 2-inch pot, and then it was held for a time to where it increased in size and then now is being sold as an 18-inch plant. And the taxable amount of cooperative distributions directly related to the sale of eligible crops produced by the producer. Allowable gross revenue includes benefits that have been paid for any of these listed agricultural programs here. So if you had gotten a payment from FSA for any of these program items, then you would also include that in your allowable gross revenue. Allowable gross revenue includes CCC loans for eligible crops if treated as income and reported to IRS. Crop insurance proceeds would also be included, and those would be minus the amount of administrative fees and premiums for eligible crops. NAP payments, any non-insurable crop disaster assistance program payments, and those would also be minus the amount of service fees and premiums for the eligible crops. And any emergency assistance for livestock, honeybee, and farm-raised fish program, and we shorten that down to ELAP. Any payments from that program for aquaculture crops only. So this would not include like livestock or honeybee loss compensations from that program. Allowable gross revenue also includes payments issued through grant agreements with FSA for losses of eligible crops, and grants from the Department of Commerce, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, or any state program funds providing direct payments for loss of eligible crops or loss of revenue from eligible crops. And then on top of that, any other revenue that would be directly related to production of eligible crops that IRS would require you to file, those would also be included as allowable gross revenue. So I just went through all of the items that are that would be included in allowable gross revenue. There are a few things that we only include though if they are in the benchmark year or disaster year. And for benchmark year only, we would include agriculture program payments that were received from the 2017 Wildfire and Hurricane Indemnity Program, or WIP, the 2018 or 2019 WIP program, or WIP Plus, or Quality Loss Adjustment Program payments, or QLA. And again, those are only included if they fall in a benchmark year of 2018 or 2019. In the disaster year, we only are going to include ERP Phase 1 payments. And I say only include, this is in addition to any of those other items that I just previously mentioned. Just keep this in mind that if you received an ERP Phase 1 payment that would have been issued to another person or entity for the producer's share of an eligible crop, and that's regardless of tax year, that would be reported also on top of the other items if it falls in the disaster year. All those items that we just went through are our list of eligible things that we do include. We have a list here of things that are not included, so they would be excluded from your allowable gross revenue. And those are benefits under any federal agriculture program from sources other than those that we just previously mentioned. So ELAP, I pointed out, we said that any payment from livestock or honeybees would be excluded. Livestock forage disaster programs, or LFP, LIP, etc. Anything that we didn't list previously that would be included, those would be excluded. Sales of livestock, animal byproducts, and any commodities that are excluded from eligible crops. So we don't include livestock sales in ERP Phase 2 or any animal byproducts like milk or eggs. Those are not included. And sales of value-added commodities found on Schedule C. So if you have a value-added, example would be grapes into wine, wine sales. Wine would typically be listed on Schedule C. So we would not include that. That would be an excluded revenue. Additionally, not included in allowable gross revenue are the resale items not held for characteristic change, also conservation program payments, and any pandemic assistance payments that were not for the loss of eligible crops or the loss of revenue from eligible crops. This is just a snapshot of page 3 of the FSA 521, which is the application, as Melissa had said, for ERP Phase 2. And this is just for the producer to be able to visualize what would be included in allowable gross revenue and what would be excluded, and where some of the sources of that information may be found. While we point out that Schedule F is kind of one of the big things that we are saying to be referenced, again, Schedule F does not have to be utilized to get your allowable gross revenue items. And so that is page 3. This is page 4. So it just continues on with the other allowable gross revenue items that we would include or exclude. And as Melissa pointed out previously, we have a pretty good website that gives us a ton of good, useful information. It provides us manual applications. We have a allowable gross revenue worksheet, which can be found on this website and also on our form site. These can be found there as well. But this is just an all around good place to find some of the tools that are going to be useful for processing a Phase 2 application. All right. Before I move on, I'm going to stop again and see if there are any questions that anybody has that from the section that we just went through.
A question did come in. It suggested, what about the money from the payroll protection program? Would this be included as revenue for the ERP? I'm guessing he's referring to when SBA had those were PPP loans or the payroll protection program.
Only payments that are directly related to those eligible crops would be included. So like that PPP loan, for example, really didn't serve a direct purpose for compensating like for crop losses. So that would not be included.
Thank you. It looks like that's all the questions we have for now.
All right, good deal. Thank you. And to clarify a little bit more, we are talking in general before we head into this benchmark year revenue section. That's general to both benchmark and disaster year sides. So whenever we say allowable gross revenue, those things that are included, those would apply both to benchmark or disaster, just whichever one you're determining or calculating in that sense. All right, so moving on. This is we're going to talk now about specifically our benchmark revenue. And again, this slide just demonstrates we're talking about allowable gross revenue, but now we're going to be talking specifically to benchmark year revenue. Benchmark year revenue is the amount of allowable gross revenue from tax year 2018 or 2019. And that's going to be what best represents the typical year of revenue for the producer's operation. There are 2 actions that the producer is going to complete for benchmark for ERP Phase 2. First, the producer will select their benchmark year, either 2018 or 2019. And then second, they're going to certify the amount of allowable revenue for that benchmark year that they select. The producer can select the benchmark year based on the disaster year that they select. And that selection can be the same benchmark year. So if you're, for example, using 2020 as your disaster year, you can select 2018 and 2019. And then if you have 2021 on top of that, you can also select that same year. Or those benchmark years can be selected separately. And I think we've got an example coming up on how those are treated differently. Yeah. So first example on that, Lucy had a qualifying disaster event that resulted in allowable gross revenue losses in both 2020 and 2021. So they'll have a 2020 and 2021 disaster year that they're applying for. And Lucy determines that 2018 is the best representation for her benchmark year for both those disaster years. So she's going to select on her application 2018 is her benchmark year for both disaster years 2020 and 2021. Different to that, in our second example, we've got Xander Inc. He had a qualifying disaster event again in both 2020 and 2021, but he determines, or Xander Inc. determines, that 2018 is the best representation for 2020, but 2019 is the best representation for 2021. So on his application, or Xander Inc.'s application, they're going to select 2018 as their benchmark year for disaster year 2020, and they're going to select 2019 as their benchmark year for disaster year 2021. And benchmark year revenue will be determined by the producer, and it's going to be based on the year that they select. As you may recall, allowable gross revenue, the producer will use their documentation, which may be a Schedule F, it could be a 1099, it could be anything that proves their amounts of revenue that are allowable based on their eligible crops. And then they're going to determine the amount of total revenue for all those items that we just went through in the allowable gross revenue section. And that's going to be the amount for their benchmark year that they select. And then there will be, of course, they'll certify that amount on their 521 in the benchmark that they select. All right, adjusted benchmark. And I don't know if that question is a new question in our Q&A, but again, I'm going to stop here and just see if there's any more questions that came up for just benchmark specifically. And it looks like that question is the previous one. And you all are free to open up your mics if you all want to, to unmute, feel free to do it. All right, not hearing anything right now. I'm going to move on into our adjusted benchmark year revenue. So what if benchmark year revenue is not available? And I think if you click one time mail, it'll, yep. So we're saying benchmark year is not there. What do we do? There is policy that we have written into ERP Phase 2 that allows you to use an adjusted benchmark year revenue. So benchmark year revenue can be adjusted by the producer so they can establish benchmark year revenue if the actual allowable gross revenue is not available. And that may be because they're a new producer. Or let's just say benchmark year revenue is not a fair representation of allowable gross revenue. And that would occur whenever there's a change in the operation from their benchmark year to their disaster year. So operation capacity refers to the potential scope that a farming operation has to produce crops or commodities with available physical resources such as land and facilities. So whenever I'm saying operation capacity has decreased or increased, what I'm saying is the scope of of producing a crop or commodity has decreased or increased because one of the physical resources or more of the physical resources has decreased or increased. And an example, if a producer has lost some land through a lease or they sold land, that operation capacity has changed. And in that situation, it has decreased. They've had a decrease in operation capacity because they have less land in the disaster year than what they had in the benchmark year. And I'll explain that a little bit further as we move on. So an adjustment for benchmark year revenue will be completed by the producer who began farming in 2020 or 2021. So this is if you're a new producer and they didn't have actual allowable gross revenue for the benchmark year. So without that, without an adjustment to benchmark year, there would be really no way to have a benchmark year revenue without some kind of adjustment. So that's what we're allowing. And so to establish on the next slide as a new producer, they're going to do and they're going to utilize an expected disaster year revenue. And that's going to be what would have been expected in the disaster year that they select prior to the impact of a qualifying disaster event. And here's an example of how that would work. So Lane is a new producer in 2020 and does not have actual allowable gross revenue in 2018 or 2019. So Lane determines that his expected allowable gross revenue in 2020 would have been $500,000, and that's prior to any impact of the disaster in 2020. So then that would be his expected disaster year revenue. And that's what Lane would certify to. He would certify $500,000 as adjusted benchmark year revenue on his FSA 521. So producers must, this is a requirement by the program. If you've had a decrease in operation capacity, we are requiring by policy an adjustment to benchmark year revenue to show that a decrease in operation capacity. So producers who do not adjust their benchmark downward in these cases, they're going to be falsely certifying a higher benchmark year revenue, which will in turn create a larger ERP Phase 2 payment. So that's why it's required. Of course, we don't want to overpay anybody. So whenever there is a decrease in operation capacity, it is required that you do make an adjustment and you adjust your benchmark down. Since ERP Phase 2 is a producer certification program, the COC may not know if there has been a decrease in operation capacity. So we do allow the COC who's going to be determining and approving or disapproving Phase 2 applications, they have the ability to request documentation so that they can see if there was a need for decrease in operation capacity. And the COC may request documentation from the producer to determine if the producer should have completed that required benchmark adjustment. This is a table that kind of shows some of the not a full list, but some of the more common reasons for a decrease in operation capacity, and also some of the documentation that you might have to prove that decrease in operation capacity. So for example, you may have had reduced production or production as what you're saying has been your decrease in operation capacity, and that is from the lost land, as I had said before. And so documentation that may show that would be like if you had a lease agreement that had an end date on it, that proves that you had lost that land due to the lease agreement ending. Or if you do complete FSA 578, the acreage reports with FSA, that can show that from the benchmark year that you selected to the disaster year, which is what we're looking at today, there's been a decrease in acres on those acreage reports with FSA. And so these are just again, it's not a full list, but just some examples of decrease in operation capacity and some of the documentation that would go along with that. And this is an example of decrease. So Hat Creek Farms LLC lost a lease for 1,000 acres in 2020. Their operation went from 2,000 acres in 2019, their benchmark year, to 1,000 acres in 2020. So right there's your decrease in operation capacity. You've lost 1,000 acres between 2019 and 2020. Hat Creek Farms must adjust their benchmark because of that. And so Hat Creek Farms has determined that their revenue has decreased $1 million. That's what the revenue would have been from that 1,000 acres that they lost. And I'm sorry, not 1,000, it's 500,000. So that would be the difference between what their benchmark would have been in the benchmark year to their what it is in the disaster year, which is $500,000. So Hat Creek Farm would certify that their adjusted benchmark year revenue for 2019 is $500,000. And then the producer may complete a adjustment if their operation capacity is increased. So if they have, for example, gained acres, whether they purchased land or picked up additional leases, then they would have an increase in operation capacity. And again, since since this is a COC run program, the COC may not know if the producer's operation has undergone that increase in operation capacity. And again, they have the ability to go through and request documentation to prove the use of increase or adjusted benchmark revenue for increased operation capacity, or the amount that was certified for that adjusted benchmark year. Like before on decrease, this is a table of some items that could be considered for increase. And again, this is not a full list. And again, it kind of shows some of the similar things, but it's in reverse. So before we had less production, now we have added production because there's an increase in operation capacity where land has been added. Again, this is not a full list, but just shows you some of the examples of what could be considered for increase in some of the documentation. And this is an example for increase. Erin bought 1,000 acres in 2021. Her operation went from 1,000 acres in 2019, the benchmark year, to 2,000 acres in 2021, the disaster year. So Erin decides to adjust her benchmark year revenue to account for that increase in operation capacity. Erin has determined that her revenue has increased from $500,000 in the benchmark year to $1 million in the disaster year, in 2021. So Erin will certify that her adjusted benchmark year revenue in 2019 is $1 million, and that's on the FSA 521 again. Not all decreases or increases in operation capacity are going to be eligible. Some decreases and increases in revenue are the result of changes in management, and those things will not be eligible. So they should not be considered when adjusting benchmark year revenue. And a good example of that is going to be whenever you do crop rotations from year to year, or if you change your farming practices, you go from conventional tillage to no-till operations, or you may increase the rate of fertilize or chemicals that you're applying to the land. So that may increase or decrease your production, but those are managerial decisions to do those, not actual tangible changes like land, gaining or subtracting land from your operation. And again, the COC has the ability to request documentation if they suspect that there's, something that needs to be taken a little bit closer look at. The county committee can request, and the applicant will have up to 30 days, according to our policy, to provide the documentation. All right, I'm going to stop again just to see if there's any questions before I move on into disaster year revenue. Don't see any in the Q&A, but if you all have a question, if you want to unmute, go right ahead. All right, I don't hear anything right now, so we're going to move on. So now we're looking at disaster year revenue. That's kind of the other side of this. What is our allowable gross revenue? So we're going to specifically look how allowable gross revenue is applied to disaster year revenue now. The disaster year allowable gross revenue will be based on the year the revenue was reported for the purpose of filing a tax form. Applicants will complete these steps on FSA 521 for each disaster year. First, the applicant will select a representative tax year to pair with their disaster year, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. And second, the applicant will certify disaster year revenue amount. So similar to benchmark, you're going to pick your year, and then you're going to certify the amount that represents that year that you select. And then the applicant will certify the percentage of expected allowable gross revenue for the disaster year based on specialty and high value crops, and then other crops. And I'll explain that more here in a minute too. So a tax year for ERP Phase 2 purposes is specific to each applicant and is based on the fiscal year. So kind of a tax language there. It'll be the fiscal year, which can be more than one, that can be more than one calendar year. Applicants will choose the tax year that best represents their disaster year allowable gross revenue according to this table. Keeping in, if applying for 2020 and 2021 disaster years together, the representative tax year must be paired with only one disaster year, and the representative tax year must be consecutive. And I'm going to point out here too, that if you are in 2020 and you decide that you want to use 2021 as your representative tax year, then you will not have the option in 2021 to select 2021 as your representative tax year. You'll have to select 2022. So for an example of how representative tax year for the disaster year works, a producer planted fall wheat in October 2020 for harvest in 2021. The wheat was affected by a freeze in December of 2020. The producer reported the revenue for the wheat crop in tax year 2021. So in this example, the disaster year is 2020. The calendar year for the qualifying disaster, which is the calendar year that a disaster occurred, but because of where that revenue falls, they're going to be selecting 2021 as their disaster year representative tax year. All right, for each disaster year selected on FSA 521, producers will be certified to the percentage of their expected allowable gross revenue from specialty and high value crops and other crops. And the percentage represents what the producer would have reasonably expected to produce in the disaster year for the qualifying disaster event, or if the qualifying disaster event had not occurred, is what I mean. So the breakdown of specialty and high value and other crops, that must equal 100% for each disaster year on the FSA 521. Actual disaster year revenue is certified by the applicant based on the allowable gross revenue, which is which they have determined in this example as $100,000. In the disaster year, producer A planted non-organic corn for grain, other crops, and raspberries would be specialty crops. And in total, their expected disaster year revenue is $220,000. So further broken down, $198,000 of that is from non-organic corn, and $22,000 from that $220,000 is from raspberries. These amounts will help the applicant certify their percents of specialty and high value crops and other crops, and to figure out their percentages for specialty and high value crops and other crops. Just figure out just the specialty and high value side of that. The applicant will compare the $22,000 from the raspberries to the total expected, which was $220,000. So they're going to be dividing $22,000 by $220,000, and that gives them 10%. Likewise, for the other crops, they're going to be comparing $198,000 to the $222,000 total. And so they're going to divide the $198,000 by the $222,000, which will give them 90%. And notice 10 and 90, that adds up to 100. So again, they both have to add up to 100. So in this example, the applicant is going to be certifying that their actual disaster year revenue is $100,000. And then their percent of specialty high value crops is 10%. And their percent of other crops is 90%. That concludes our allowable gross revenue sections, and I'm going to be passing it on to Michael now. But again, it's a good time to stop to see if anybody has any questions on what we went over so far. All right, Michael, I guess it's good to go.
All right, thank you, Aaron. So we're going to talk now, we're going to move into just talking about the application, FSA 521, which has already been mentioned a couple of times before by Aaron and Melissa. But so the FSA 521, it may be used to apply for eligible crop revenue losses sustained in one or both the 2020 and 2021 calendar years. Unlike phase one, this application will not be mailed to producers. Producers will use the traditional methods of filing the application in the county office or obtaining a blank application through the ERP website or the USDA eForms database that they've talked about already. Producers will submit one application for their entire operation nationwide, and then applications will be accepted nationwide, but a copy of the application must be forwarded to the recording county office for processing. Our goal is to utilize an electronic signature for all ERP Phase 2 applications, and we'll move into that next. As far as applying for the application submission, as I stated, the current policy allows for applications to be submitted according to the following methods: in person, when available, by mail, electronically, or fax. The FSA 521, the 521A, and the 522 forms are available on the ERP public facing side, as well as the ERP Phase 2 tool, which has been mentioned already before. When we're talking about e-signature, those applicants will electronically sign the ERP application, and they can do this online, or they can do this at the office. Producers do not need special software or electronic devices to complete the e-signature process. So moving on to the next slide, Mel. So this is a picture of what the FSA 521 application looks like. So in part, at the top, you've got the application number, the recording state name and code, also the recording name, county name and code. Part A is the producer agreement section of the application. And by signing this application, the applicants agree to comply with all the provisions that are listed in Part A. In addition to compliance with those regulatory requirements, which are in 7 CFR Part 760 Subpart S, the applicants also agree that the decrease in allowable gross revenue, as Aaron talked about earlier, that was experienced was due to necessary expenses related to losses of eligible crops, due in whole or in part to a qualifying disaster event or related condition that occurred in the calendar year 2020 or 2021. Producers also agree to maintain their supportive documentation for 3 years, as Melissa stated earlier. And then they also have to comply with payment limitation and file all appropriate eligibility documents within the allowable time frame. And then they're going to acknowledge that the application, application isn't considered complete until the producer agrees to comply with linkage requirements by filing that FSA 522 crop insurance and or NAP coverage agreement. And then moving on to Part B, that's going to be the producer information. And that's going to just be your full name, address, and phone number of the producer who's applying for the 2020 and or 2021. And that's obtained from the FSA from our records. So moving on, this is kind of what we've got 2 different parts to this application because we have 2 different disaster years. So Part C is for the 2020 disaster year revenue certification. That's going to be completed if the applicant sustained eligible decreases in allowable gross revenue due to a qualifying disaster event or related condition that occurred in calendar year 2020. If you don't have a loss in 2020, then you can skip this section. You don't have to fill that out. It's just for if you had a loss in 2020. And then on those, if you'll notice on those, we have some COC use only blocks 11 through 15. That's for determining reasonableness and the approval or disapproval process by disaster year. So that, as Aaron mentioned, the COC has authority to question producer certifications on there and have them turn in additional documentation if needed. So Part D, that's going to be the 2021 disaster year revenue certification. Once again, this is going to be completed if they had an eligible loss in 2021 calendar year. And same as before, if they don't have a loss, then they can skip this section and they don't have to fill it out. But you're going to use, and as we talked about here, if you look at block 18, you're going to choose your benchmark year as Aaron talked about. Then in 19, you're going to put the benchmark year revenue. And then in 20, you're going to choose that revenue year, representative revenue year that you want to use there. Moving on through the application, part E is going to be the producer certification. So by signing this form, the producer or the authorized representative listed on the application is applying for phase 2 payment, certifying that the information is true and correct, and acknowledging that they experienced a decrease in allowable gross revenue due to a qualifying disaster event or related condition. And then they're also agreeing to comply with ERP Phase 2 regulations in 7 CFR Part 760, Subpart S, and then that they're going to provide all the necessary information to verify the information that they're putting on the 521 is accurate and allow FSA to access all documents and records of the producer to retain documentation in support of their application for the 3 years after the date of the approval. And then they also have to agree to purchase linkage either through NAP or crop insurance, and at that certain level, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Part F is going to be the county committee determination. This is where the county committee is going to go in there and sign that they're approving the application, and they'll also do the date there. Please note that an approved 521 is subject to prompt pay interest. So we've got to make sure that we do that timely. Slide. So as far as a complete application is considered, an application is considered complete once the producer or authorized representative requesting a payment completes all of those required entries, signs and submits both the FSA 521 and 522. And then as Melissa talked about earlier, as far as eligibility documentation, which we're talking about the 902, 901, 1026, 1047, and then those, if applicable, forms the 510, FSA 510, and CCC 860. If those have to be done within 60 days of the phase 2 application deadline, if they're not already on file. Spot check policy, that hasn't been established at this time yet, so we really can't say for sure what's going to happen with that. We know there will be one, but at this time we don't know what that's going to be. So we just wanted to make you all aware of that there will be a spot check policy, and once that's been determined, then we'll send out information on that. So this program is a self-certification program. It is subject to spot check. County committees can request documentation from an applicant if they are questioning some of the producer certification numbers on the application. And so if they do that, they do have that right. And then when and if they submit request that information, then the producer has 30 days from when it's requested to turn that in to the county committee, or otherwise the application will be disapproved. As far as supportive documentation, these are just a few of the examples that could be provided if a producer is requested to turn in those documents. Financial documents such as a business plan or cash flow that shows the expected level of revenue that they're going to receive, assembly sheets, sales receipts, ledgers of income, crop insurance, SNAP, and WIP plus records. Those are all examples of what kind of documentation that a producer could turn in if requested by a county committee. So moving on to the ERP Phase 2 payments. Just a brief overview. Payments are going to be calculated for 2020 and 2021 by the different sections on the FSA 521, as we saw earlier for the producer. It's subject to an initial $2,000 max payment provision. So Part C for the 2020 program year for specialty and high value, Part C for the 2020 program year for other crops, and then Part D is for 2021, as we talked about earlier, for specialty and high value, and then also for other crops. So we're going to have an initial at most $2,000 payment for this, and then once we figure out availability of funding, then you'll get the rest of that payment or a factored payment amount depending on what the availability of funds that is left. So I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions over what I've talked about as far as application goes or anything right now before we move into linkage? Oh, there is one question, clarification on the ERP deadline. That is, it is June 2nd as of today, for all intents and purposes. Okay, go ahead and move into linkage. So as we talked about already, there is a linkage requirement. If you're going to choose to accept the payment from ERP Phase 2, you do have to either buy crop insurance or NAP coverage, and you do have to file an accurate acreage report for those linkage years in order to be eligible to keep your ERP or to get an ERP Phase 2 payment. The Phase 2 application does not identify the crops that suffered a revenue loss. So producers are going to be required to complete that FSA 522 and identify all crops that suffered a revenue loss. This is just a copy of that linkage form, the FSA 522. So you've got your producer name, recording state name and code, application number, and then the recording county name and code as well. Part A, moving into Part A, that's going to be where producers are going to list all the crops that suffered a revenue loss. We'll need the crop commodity name, the crop type, and then the intended use on there. Moving along, Part B of the linkage agreement, this is where the producer is going to read this and make sure that they understand that they are required to purchase crop insurance or NAP for the next 2 available years after they receive a payment. It's got all the instructions in there as well. They need to make sure that they read this and understand by signing this in 8A and 8B, then and 8C dating, that they are saying that they agree to do what it says in Part B as far as the linkage agreement. So linkage years, as we stated, it's got to be purchased for the next 2 available crop years after the payment, but no later than 2026. So the next 2 available crop years are determined from the date that a producer receives an ERP payment. And so that may vary depending on the timing and availability of coverage. And we'll go into more of that in the next few slides. Depending on the date when a producer receives an ERP Phase 2 payment and the applicable application and sales closing date for the crop, those next 2 available crop years may be any of the following: 23 and 24, 24 and 25, or 25 and 26. So that the linkage requirement does apply to all counties that the crop or crops identified on the FSA 522 is planted in, the applicable linkage years. And an example for this is producer Ayla certified on her 522 that she suffered a revenue loss on fresh strawberries. Producer Ayla must obtain crop insurance or NAP coverage in all counties she planted fresh strawberries in, the applicable linkage years. We do anticipate that RMA is going to assist us in making those linkage determinations. So as far as the coverage levels are concerned, for those RMA insured crops, the coverage level has to be purchased at a minimum level of 6,100. And then for NAP crops, the coverage level has to be purchased at a minimum level of the basic 50-55 catastrophic level. If the crops are not insurable or if NAP is not obtainable, then producers must purchase a whole farm revenue protection plan at 6,100 or higher. So we have an example here. Producer A certified that he suffered a revenue loss on hard red winter wheat for grain on the FSA 522. He received his ERP Phase 2 payment in December of 2022. The sales closing date to purchase insurance for the 2023 crop year in the producer state is September 30th, 2022. So therefore, his linkage years would be 2024 and 2025. We have another example here. Producer Brenna plants yellow corn for grain in Arkansas and Missouri. She receives ERP Phase 2 benefits for 2021 yellow corn for grain losses and received an ERP payment on March 5th of 2023. The sales closing date to purchase insurance for 2023 in Arkansas is February 28th of 2023. And then the sales date to purchase insurance for 2023 in Missouri is March 15th of 2023. Therefore, based on the date that Brenna received her ERP benefits and the sales closing dates of the crops, the next 2 available crop years are 2023 and 2024 for Missouri, and then 2024 and 2025 for Arkansas. Producers should file crop acreage reports with FSA that document the crops grown on their farm or ranch and their intended uses. Each year, USDA agencies collect data relating to crops through crop acreage reports. If a producer wants to participate in many USDA programs, including crop insurance, safety net, conservation, and disaster assistance programs, the producer must file timely acreage reports to remain eligible for program benefits. So they can file those crop acreage reports by filling out the FSA 578 form. Please check with your county and your state. It depends on they have different reporting deadlines for those. But the local USDA service centers staff can help you with that. And as I stated earlier, you do need to file an accurate acreage report with FSA during those linkage years. To file an acreage report with FSA, you have to have the crop and crop type, the intended use of the crop, the number of acres of that crop that's planted, and then we have to have a map with the approximate boundaries for where the crop is, the planting dates, the planting pattern when applicable, the producer shares, the irrigation practices, and then acreage that was prevented from planting when applicable. So linkage is not required if an applicant quits farming or an applicant entity completely dissolves and the majority share of the members are no longer farming. Linkage is only required in counties the crop is planted in linkage years. And then note that this does apply only to the year that the crop was not planted. So a participant that doesn't meet linkage requirements is required to repay the amount of the ERP Phase 2 payment plus any applicable interest that has accrued. So any questions on linkage requirements? So I do have one. Are there any different rules or stipulations on NAP coverage with socially disadvantaged producers dealing with ERP Phase 2? I know when we're talking about socially disadvantaged producers, they can fill out the 860 form, which that would waive their the premium, the service fee that's associated, with the NAP application for coverage. But as far as different rules, as far as what coverage you have to get, there's no difference on that. Okay, we'll move on to our last section. It's just got a few more slides to go over, and then we'll be through, and we'll open it up for questions if anybody has any other questions. But so when we've talked briefly and kind of shown a couple of slides on our emergency relief program application tool. Just wanted to show it one more time as far as where it's at so that everyone will be aware. This is at our ERP public facing internet site where producers can go on and look at, and on here we have our 521 application. We have the 521A gross revenue worksheet that we have, and then we also have the application, the ERP tool on the site as well. So this is just kind of a picture of what that tool is going to look like if you pull it up, and then it kind of takes you through step by step on how to fill that out. And that is all I have. So we'll open it up for questions. We'll be glad to answer any questions anybody has. I'm not seeing any other questions, so guess that will conclude our training unless there's other questions. That's all we have for y'all today. Thank you for your time and attention, and we are glad to have brought you this training today. Chris, did you have any closing remarks, sir?
I don't have any. Thank you all. We appreciate it. If you have questions, cooperators have questions, just let us know. Thanks, everyone.